After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they had finally arrived. There it was, the promised land. For the first time, the people of Israel gazed with tears in their eyes at the land. The journey was over. Before them stretched the green and fertile promised land. But no one rejoiced. They stood utterly paralyzed with fear. Moses was dead. The greatest leader in Israel's history was gone. The man who led them out of Egypt, spoke with God, and guided them to this very place was gone. They were alone. Now before their eyes lay the land that had been sworn to Abraham. The land their fathers had dreamed of and for which they had buried an entire generation in the desert sand. But that land was not empty. It was filled with fortified cities and fearsome armies. Bloodthirsty kings, even giants. The promise was right in front of them, but the path to reach it seemed impossible. Before them, the Jordan River roared, wild and overflowing, and beyond the river stood Jericho. The great city with walls that seemed to touch the sky. Over 2 million people stood frozen in place, paralyzed, unsure what to do. Israel had finally reached the edge of the promised land, but they could not enter it. At that moment, Israel was nothing more than a wandering tribe. They lived in tents in the wilderness. They had no army. They didn't even have a leader. They wondered, what do we do now? Who will guide us? Who will take Moses' place? That is when God spoke not to the crowd, but to one man, to Joshua. Joshua wasn't a prophet. He was Moses' faithful assistant. Since he was a boy, he had walked by his side. He had witnessed the plagues, watched the Red Sea split in two, and fought in impossible battles. But he had never been the one in charge. God was direct and told him plainly, "My servant Moses is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them." The command was clear. Joshua had to stand up, take leadership, and guide all the people across the Jordan, all of them. And along with the command, God gave him a promise. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. No one would be able to stand against him. No enemy would defeat him. God would be with him just as he had been with Moses. But there was one clear condition. Joshua had to keep the law, never turn from it, never forget it, and meditate on it day and night. Victory wouldn't depend on the army, but on obedience. And then God repeated 3 times the command that would define his entire journey. Be strong and courageous. Joshua accepted the command, but he knew the mission was monumental. He had to lead a nomadic people to conquer a land defended by fortified cities and fearsome warriors. Now all the responsibility fell on him. He lifted his eyes to the horizon. Before him lay the Jordan, and beyond it, Jericho awaited. Jericho was no ordinary city. It's one of the oldest cities in the world, inhabited since 9,000 years before Christ. To the eyes of Israel, Jericho was an unconquerable city, an impenetrable fortress with double walls that soared 40 feet into the sky, bristling with watchtowers under constant guard. Joshua understood that before moving all the people, he needed to know what they were up against. He didn't send armies. Quite the opposite. He acted in silence and secretly sent spies. 2 spies to Jericho, the city that guarded the entrance to Canaan. Their mission was simple: go scout out the land in Jericho. The spies slipped in by night and hid in the most unlikely place. They went to a brothel to the house of a woman named Rahab. Rahab was a woman of ill root, a marginalized Canaanite prostitute, who lived literally built into the outer wall of the city. In ancient times, casemate walls, those double walls, were often filled in with dwellings for the poorest people. There, right in the most despised corner of Jericho, the spies took refuge, but everything went wrong fast. That very night, someone saw them enter and word flew to the king's palace. He sent his best guards to Rahab's house. The spies were trapped. For Rahab, it was a matter of life or death. If she told the truth, the spies would die. If she lied and got caught, she'd be executed for treason, loyalty to her king, or faith in a god she'd only heard stories about. In that moment, Rahab made a choice that would seal her fate. With stunning composure, she hid the spies under bundles of flax on the rooftop and lied to the king's soldiers with calculated coolness. Yes, they came here, but they left at dusk. If you hurry now, You can definitely catch them. The soldiers bought it and raced off toward the Jordan fords. The heavy gates of Jericho slammed shut behind them, sealing the city. But this raises a much bigger question. Why? Why would a prostitute risk her life for two enemies of her people? When the danger passed, Rahab climbed up to the roof, and in the darkness, she revealed her true motive. I know the Lord has given you this land. We've heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. For 40 years, the stories of the Red Sea splitting in two had been told as horror tales. To the children of Jericho, the entire city feared the God who parted the seas. There, among the shadows on the rooftop, Rahab proposed a deal. In exchange for her betrayal of the king and her loyalty to God, Rahab asked for a covenant. She would save their lives, and they must swear by their God to spare her and her entire family when the city fell. The spies swore it would be so, and gave her a simple instruction. Hang a scarlet cord in the window. It was a powerful symbol, the same color as the lamb's blood that protected the Israelites in Egypt. In the original Hebrew, the word for cord is tikva. And this word carries a double meaning. It also means hope. Rahab didn't just hang a cord. She hung her hope visibly in the window for all the world to see. This same woman, despised by her own people, would end up being one of the few women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus himself. The spies escaped by climbing down through that window to the outside of the wall. Rahab guided them toward the mountain, and after 3 days in hiding, they returned to Joshua with a report that changed the course of history. The Lord has given the entire land into our hands. All who live there are melting in fear. Joshua smiled. This was the confirmation that God's promise was about to be fulfilled. The time to cross the Jordan had come. The march to Jericho was beginning. And the battle for the promised land would not be won with swords, but with faith and obedience. With this news, Israel's heart filled with courage. Joshua mobilized the people, and they advanced to the banks of the Jordan, only to face a wall of water. The Bible gives us a crucial detail. It was harvest time. During this season, the melting snows from distant Mount Hermon transformed the Jordan into a violent, muddy, lethal torrent that overflowed its banks, dragging mud, rocks, and trees in its wake. Picture a river at full flood stage, wider than a football field with enough force to rip trees from their roots. Now picture leading 2 million people, men, women, children, and livestock across it without a single bridge, without a single boat. It seemed impossible. For 3 days they remained there, stopped before the river. Then Joshua gave a command. Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things. At dawn, on the third day, the command was carried out. Leading the entire nation, the priests lifted up the Ark of the Covenant, the visible symbol of God's presence. They wouldn't cross using boats or bridges, but by following a wooden chest covered in gold, the Ark of the Covenant. They had to keep nearly half a mile between the people and the Ark. No one could get too close to God's presence. Joshua made it clear. The moment the priest's feet touched the water's edge, the river would stop. Not before. First the step of faith, then the miracle. And that's exactly what happened. Silence fell over the crowd. The moment of truth had arrived. The priests, bearing the weight of gold and sacred wood on their shoulders, descended toward the riverbank, and when their sandals brushed against the current, the impossible happened. Suddenly, the waters flowing from upstream stopped dead in their tracks, and began piling up as if crashing against an invisible wall of glass. The remaining water flowed away toward the Dead Sea, and the riverbed lay exposed. While the people watched in awe, the priests walked to the middle of the dry riverbed and stood there steady, holding the ark on their shoulders. And then the entire nation began to cross. It was a silent, solemn procession. 2 million men, women, children, flocks, and carts crossing from one side to the other, leaving the wilderness behind to finally set foot on the promised land. The ark remained motionless at the center like a divine anchor holding the miracle in place. An echo of the Red Sea, but now under a new leader. And as they crossed, God did something more. He exalted Joshua before the people, so they would know that just as he had been with Moses, he was now with him. When the last Israelite crossed over, Joshua halted the nation. Instinct said to run or arm themselves. But God told Joshua to do something for remembrance. Joshua called 12 men, one from each tribe, and commanded them to go back to the middle of the river, right where the priest's feet still stood firm. Take 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest stood, and carry them out. The 12 men hoisted the heavy rocks onto their shoulders, pulled from the epicenter of the miracle, and carried them to the camp. Only then did the priests receive the command to come out. And the very instant the last priest set foot on the opposite shore, the invisible dam burst. Suddenly, the Jordan crashed back down with its ancient fury. As if nothing had ever happened, the Jordan River returned to its place, overflowing its banks with the same violence as before, sealing the entrance behind them. The miracle was over. The river had closed at their backs, and the way of return had vanished. There was no turning back now. But everything had changed. Israel had crossed the Jordan. At last, the promised land was beneath their feet, and before them, finally, rose Jericho. The conquest had begun. That night they set up their first camp in the promised land, a place called Gilgal, east of Jericho. And there Joshua placed the 12 stones they had taken from the river, forming a monument, and proclaimed, "When your children ask what these stones mean, you shall answer them, that the waters of the Jordan were divided before the ark of the covenant of the Lord." The monument was a reminder that the living God had been in the midst of his people. That day, the people's perception shifted. They no longer saw Joshua as Moses' shadow, but as the undisputed leader of the nation. News of how the Jordan River had dried up spread like wildfire, and panic seized the Canaanite kings. Fear had switched sides. It was the perfect moment to attack. The enemy was terrified and demoralized. But instead of attacking Jericho, God commanded something surprising. Stop and be circumcised. For 40 years in the wilderness, the mark of the covenant had been forgotten. An entire generation had grown up without it. Now, at the enemy's gates, Joshua didn't order swords to be sharpened, but flint knives. A mass circumcision left all the men incapacitated for several days, and completely vulnerable in enemy territory. For 3 days, Israel's entire army remained vulnerable, recovering encamped deep in enemy territory, trusting solely in God's protection. It seemed like military suicide, but it was a lesson. The people needed to reconcile with God. It was an extremely high-risk maneuver. For days, Israel's army lay paralyzed by the pain of recovery, exposed to a surprise attack. But miraculously, the Canaanites didn't attack. They were paralyzed by fear. Once restored and healed, they celebrated the first Passover in the Promised Land. Exactly 40 years had passed since the first Passover in Egypt. A perfect cycle had come full circle. For the first time, the children of Israel tasted the actual fruit of the Promised Land, grain from the earth. And the next morning, something that had been constant for 40 years simply stopped. And the manna ceased the day after they began eating the produce of the land. And the children of Israel had manna no more. The bread from heaven stopped. No longer would they look to the sky for food. Now they must look to the earth and take it with their own hands. The survival phase was over. With the camp secure, Joshua turned his attention to the first obstacle, the imposing city of Jericho, whose walls seemed impregnable. One night, as he studied the fortress, he suddenly saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword. Joshua, his warrior instincts kicking in, demanded, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" The man replied, "Neither. I have come as commander of the Lord's army." Joshua fell face down in worship. Then the heavenly commander gave him an order. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground." These were the very words God spoke to Moses at the burning bush. It was Christ manifesting himself before his incarnation. The battlefield had become holy ground. The message was unmistakable. The same God who initiated the Exodus was now present to lead the conquest. There, in the shadow of a pagan fortress, God delivered his battle plan. It was quite possibly the most absurd strategy ever conceived. No battering rams or catapults, no ladders or arrows. The plan was simply to march. For 6 days, the entire army would circle The city once a day in complete silence. Led by 7 priests blowing ram's horn trumpets. The shofar. And the Ark of the Covenant. Imagine the psychological warfare. Inside Jericho, the sentries expected fire and battle cries, but saw only a solemn, silent procession. All they heard was the rhythmic sound of thousands of footsteps and the haunting blast of the horns. The tension was unbearable. On the 7th day, the instructions changed. They wouldn't march once, but 7 times. The sun beat down and dust rose as they circled again and again. The pressure building in the air was explosive. The battle was about to begin. After the 7th lap, the priests blasted their trumpets with a long piercing sound. That was the signal. Joshua turned to the 2 million souls of Israel and shouted, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." A scream that had been bottled up through years of slavery exploded. In a single instant, this wasn't a human battle cry. It was a roar of faith and a promise fulfilled. At that moment, the mighty walls of Jericho, a marvel of defensive engineering for its time, weren't knocked down. They simply collapsed. They fell in on themselves, creating a perfect rubble ramp. For an assault, the army didn't have to climb. Every man charged straight ahead and took the city. In the midst of the total destruction, commanded by God, only one house remained standing. Rahab's, the woman marked by a scarlet cord in her window. Through the dust, debris, and slaughter, the 2 spies raced toward the only section of wall that seemed to have survived or remained accessible. The house with the scarlet cord. Tied to the window, the spies kept their oath and brought out Rahab along with her entire family. Saving them from destruction, she and her family were the only ones spared in the midst of judgment. The city was set ablaze, and everything in it was destroyed, except for the silver, gold, and bronze, and iron vessels, which were consecrated to God's treasury. Joshua then pronounced a prophetic curse over the smoking ruins. Whoever tried to rebuild Jericho would pay the price with the lives of his children. The smoke of Jericho rose to heaven. The euphoria in Israel's camp was absolute. After 40 years in the wilderness, they felt invincible. If God could bring down walls with trumpets, who could stand against them? With Jericho's fall, the fame of Joshua and his God spread throughout the land. The Canaanites now knew they weren't facing a mere army. They were facing a God who parted rivers and toppled walls. With a shout, but while Israel celebrated, a shadow loomed over the camp. A man named Ashan from the tribe of Judah had defiled the victory. He was walking through the rubble when he spotted among the spoils consecrated to God a valuable Babylonian robe, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold. Greed clouded his judgment. He took them and buried them beneath his own tent. No one saw him. But the consequences were about to unfold. Unaware of the betrayal, Joshua set his sights on the next target, the small city of Ai. Compared to the majesty of Jericho, I was nothing more than a speck on the map, barely an outpost perched on a hill. Joshua's spies returned with a report dripping with arrogance. Don't wear out the whole army. Just send 2,000 or 3,000 men. Joshua, infected by their overconfidence, he stopped consulting God. Then the unthinkable happened. 3,000 Israeli soldiers marched up the hill, but the men of Ai burst out to meet them with savage ferocity, shattering the Israelite ranks and chasing them down the hillside, killing 36 of them. The once invincible army fled in panic. It wasn't a massive slaughter, but the psychological impact was devastating. The Bible says the people's hearts melted and became like water. The bubble of invincibility had burst. Joshua, bewildered and anguished, tore his clothes and fell face down before the Ark of the Covenant. Until evening, he couldn't understand why God had brought them across the Jordan, only to hand them over to the enemy. Then Joshua cried out, "Something very dangerous. If only we had stayed on the other side." For a moment, his lament sounded like that of the faithless generation who died in the wilderness. But heaven answered him with fury. "Get up. Why are you lying face down like this? Israel has sinned." The problem wasn't the enemy's strength. It was inside the camp. God revealed to him that someone had stolen from the consecrated spoils, and that his presence would not accompany them in battle while corruption remained in the camp. Now the curse weighed upon all the people. As long as that sin stayed hidden, God's presence would not fight for them. The next morning, a solemn casting of lots took place. A trial by divine elimination. Tribe by tribe, family by family, the circle tightened until a single man stood exposed. Achan from the tribe of Judah. There was no escape. Joshua confronted him, but not with a judge's wrath, rather with a father's sorrow. My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and tell me now what you have done. Then Achan confessed what he had done. Among the ruins of Jericho, I saw a beautiful Babylonian robe. In the plunder, I coveted it and took it. The items were found exactly where he said, buried beneath his tent, but his secret had already cost the lives of 36 of his brothers. The justice was terrible, but necessary to purify the nation. Achan, his family, and all his possessions were taken to the valley that would forever be called Acre, meaning trouble. There they were stoned and burned beneath a great heap of rocks. A monument to the consequences of greed, with the sin thoroughly rooted out. God's voice was heard once again. Do not be afraid or discouraged. Take all your fighting men and go up to attack Ai. But this time, God would not use a supernatural miracle, but rather a brilliant military strategy. He gave Joshua a masterful plan, a classic ambush. Joshua sent 30,000 of his finest warriors to hide by night behind Ai, while he himself advanced with the main army in plain sight, acting as bait. At dawn, the king of Ai took the bait. Emboldened by his earlier victory, he launched all his soldiers in pursuit of Joshua, leaving the city completely defenseless. Joshua and his men feigned a desperate retreat, luring the enemy farther and farther from their walls. And then, at the precise moment, God gave the command. Joshua raised his spear toward heaven. It was the signal. From their hiding places, 30,000 warriors from the ambush surged forth like a flood, seized the empty city and set it ablaze. And when the warriors of Ai looked back, they saw the column of smoke from their homes rising to the sky. And suddenly Joshua's main army wheeled around, attacked head-on while the ambush force cut off their retreat. They were doomed, trapped between Joshua's sword and the fire of their homes. There was no escape. The victory was complete. Ai was reduced to a heap of ruins forever. But instead of celebrating, Joshua led all the people to the valley of Shah. There, fulfilling the command Moses had given decades before, he built an altar with uncut stones, just as the law requires, so that no human tool would alter its holiness. And on those stones, he wrote a copy of the law and read it aloud for everyone to hear. He proclaimed every word of the covenant, every commandment, reminding them that their survival in the land depended on their obedience. Remarkably, the natural acoustics of this valley allow a human voice to carry for miles. Joshua divided the people, half facing Mount Gerizim, the mountain of blessing, and the other half facing Mount El, the mountain of cursing. Men, women, children, and foreigners listened in solemn silence. The lesson had been learned the hardest way possible. The conquest of the promised land didn't depend on the strength of their swords, but on the purity of their hearts and their obedience to God. News of Jericho and Ai's fall spread like wildfire. Israel's victory struck fear everywhere, and the Canaanite king's ancient rivals forged a desperate alliance to annihilate Israel. But the people of Gibeon, a city of mighty warriors, chose a different path. They decided that fighting Israel was suicide. So they plotted something different. Deception. They staged a flawless performance, disguising themselves in rags and worn-out sandals. They loaded their donkeys with moldy bread and tattered sacks and headed to Joshua's camp. They looked like ghosts from an endless journey. When they arrived at Gilgal, they lied to Joshua, claiming they had come from a distant land and asking him to make a peace treaty. Then Joshua and the leaders of Israel made a serious mistake. They trusted what their eyes could see instead of asking God. Joshua fell into the trap, signed the peace agreement, and swore to protect them. 3 days later, when they discovered who these people really were, the Israelites exploded in rage. They felt humiliated and wanted to kill them for being liars. But Joshua stopped them and said, "We made a promise in God's name. We cannot kill them." The punishment for the Gibeonites was to spare their lives. But in exchange, They would have to work forever cutting wood and drawing water for Israel's sanctuary. And so, the Gibeonites lost their freedom and were condemned to serve Israel for the rest of history. But this alliance had consequences. When Adoni-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, learned that Gibeon had surrendered to Israel, he panicked. He called on 4 other kings to attack Gibeon for being traitors. Cornered, the Gibeonites, now servants of Israel, called out to Joshua for help. And Joshua didn't think twice. He had to keep his promise. He gathered his best soldiers and marched all night, climbing mountains without rest to launch a surprise attack. At dawn, they fell upon the enemy. The surprise attack was devastating. The 5 kings never saw it coming, and their armies descended into chaos. As they fled, suddenly God hurled giant hailstones down on the enemy. More died from the ice than from the sword. The battle was going well, but evening was approaching. If night fell, the enemies would escape, regroup, and return to attack another day. Darkness was the Amorite king's only hope of escape. Joshua needed more time. He needed more light. And then he did something incredible. In front of all his soldiers, Joshua stood before his army and in full view of everyone shouted a command that defied the laws of the universe. Sun, stand still over Gibeon and you moon over the valley of Aaron. Suddenly the impossible happened. The sun stood still. And the moon stopped until the nation had avenged themselves against their enemies. The universe obeyed. The sun halted at its zenith. And the moon froze in place, stretching the day for nearly 24 hours. And with that extra light, Israel achieved total victory. Israel's soldiers, though exhausted, seized that extra daylight to finish the battle and secure their triumph. The 5 kings, who had fled like cowards, were discovered hiding in a cave at Makkader, and there would be no negotiation. Joshua commanded his captains to place their feet on the necks of these monarchs, an ancient gesture symbolizing complete subjugation and ultimate victory. After the execution, the army returned to Gilgal. In a single lightning campaign, southern Canaan had been conquered. That day was etched into history as the day when the universe itself stopped to fight for his people. Yet, victory in the south brought no peace. It awakened a greater beast. News of the Amorite king's defeat reached the ears of Jabin, king of Hazor, the most powerful metropolis in all of Canaan. When Jabin heard how Joshua had crushed the southern kings, he understood that waiting for the attack was signing his own death warrant. So, he decided to strike first and sent messengers to every corner of the region, summoning a massive alliance that surpassed anything seen before. He gathered an army so immense it seemed like sand on the seashore, an uncountable multitude stretching as far as the eye could see. A human tide that congregated by the waters of Meon, ready to crush Israel. But it wasn't just the numbers that made their blood run cold. It was their technology. For the first time, Israel would face the most feared weapon of the ancient world. War chariots, hundreds of them, reinforced with iron and pulled by horses trained for battle. To give you an idea, facing a war chariot on foot was like trying to fight a tank with a sword today. They were fast, unstoppable killing machines designed to break ranks and crush bodies. Israel's army, made up of former slaves and desert wanderers, felt fear freeze their blood. How could they win against this military machine? At that moment of maximum tension, on the shores of the waters of Meon, the two armies met face to face. But then God spoke directly to Joshua, saying, "Don't be afraid of them, for by this time tomorrow, I will hand all of them over to Israel slain." Yet God gave him a very strange command. "You shall burn their chariots with fire and hamstring their horses." What did hamstring mean? It meant cutting the tendons in the horses' legs, so they would be lame and useless for war. This seems cruel and illogical, but there was an important reason behind it. Here lies the great strategic lesson. God didn't want Israel to adopt the enemy's weapons. He didn't want his people trusting in the speed of horses or the strength of iron, but for their faith to remain anchored in the one who alone guarantees victory. He wanted them to keep trusting in him alone. Joshua obeyed and launched his best strategy. Surprise! He unleashed a lightning offensive at dawn, falling upon the coalition's camp by the waters of Meon. giving them no time to organize their war machines. The attack was so sudden and brutal that panic seized the enormous army. The great tactical advantage of the chariots became their worst nightmare. In the confusion and rough terrain, they became useless, blocking their own escape. The massive alliance crumbled. Israel pursued them relentlessly, completely destroying the northern army. With the coalition shattered, Joshua marched straight to Hazor, the capital that had orchestrated the rebellion. He captured it, executed King Jabin, and burned the entire city to the ground. It was the only city in that region he destroyed by fire as a sign that the head of the rebellion had been severed. The great northern metropolis burned to its foundations, becoming a pillar of smoke and a warning to all of Canaan. These great battles broke the organized military power of the land, but the conquest wasn't a single-day event. The war stretched on for several years until 31 kings were overthrown. The number 31 was no coincidence. It symbolized the impossible made possible. A nation of former slaves without a professional army had dismantled Canaan's entire power structure, and so the promised land, once just a distant dream for slaves in the wilderness, was now beneath their feet. Now it was time to start building a home. After the great victory in the north and the burning of Hazor, we might think that was the end of it all. But Joshua chapter 11 and 12 tell us something more realistic. The conquest wasn't a weekend event. It was a long, grueling process. It was 7 years of relentless military campaigns, 7 years sleeping in camps, 7 years of forced marches, 7 years of summer and winter, fighting against fortified cities and giants.
God, give me strength.
And once the main armies had been defeated, there remained unfinished business, a matter that had terrorized Israel for decades. The Anakites, the sons of Anak, they were the race of giants who 40 years earlier had so terrified Israel's spies that the people fled into the wilderness for over 40 years. Joshua had to break this cycle of fear. He knew there could be no real peace while that fear existed. So he went up into the mountains of Hebron, Deir, and Anab and wiped out the giants. He left none in the mountains of Israel, proving that those invincible monsters also bled and fell. It was psychological warfare, a message for his people and for history. Giants fall too. When God fights, the size of the enemy is irrelevant. The Bible seals it with a powerful statement. Not one of the Anakim remained in the land of the children of Israel. The victory was complete, but there was one exception. The giants didn't disappear entirely. The Bible reveals that some giants survived and fled to cities like Gath and Ashdod. And this is the incredible origin of Goliath's story. Centuries later, from the city of Gath, a new giant champion would rise to terrorize a new generation of Israelites.
Watch the corner there,
Joshua,
keep it steady.
without knowing it, left the seed of a conflict that a young shepherd named David would have to resolve. But the conquest wasn't instant. We tend to remember the miracle of Jericho where the walls fell with a shout. But that was the exception. The reality was much harsher. In the Bible, we read, Joshua waged war a long time with all those kings. It was years of sweat, of forced marches, of military strategy, and of faith. Tested on the battlefield, God gave them the land, but they had to fight for every inch. Israel had won. The impregnable walls of Jericho were dust. The enemy kings had fallen, and the battles had ceased. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and years of brutal conquest, children played in the fields and families harvested vineyards. Time marched on and Joshua began to feel the weight of his years. He had grown old. And though the main territories had been conquered and the mighty kings defeated, the mission wasn't over. Pockets of resistance remained, enemy strongholds, in a land that needed to be completely purified. Then God stepped in and spoke to Joshua. You are now old and advanced in years. Yet there remains very much land to possess. The unified conquest had ended. The era of inheritance was beginning. God was telling him that his days as a sword-wielding general were over, and his season as a statesman had begun. The mission had shifted. Joshua needed to hang up his sword and divide the land among the tribes of Israel. Joshua received orders to distribute the land yet to be conquered. Each tribe would receive its portion, and every family would be responsible for driving out the remaining enemies from their own territory. The soldiers laid down their swords. After years of battle, dust, and miracles, the land finally rested from war. But now, a different challenge began, perhaps more complex than warfare itself. Distributing the inheritance and learning how to live in it. Each family would receive their inheritance, their own battlefield, and their home. Lots were cast and valleys and mountains were assigned. And so began the Great Distribution. A historic moment when the maps and borders of what would become the nation of Israel were drawn. The distribution of land started with the largest and most powerful tribe, Judah. The territory they received was immense. From the arid desert on the border with Edom to the waves of the Mediterranean Sea, a vast and diverse region with fertile valleys, barren deserts, and rugged mountains. Yet Judah's victory carried a dark stain. Despite their immense power, they encountered a rocky fortress they could not conquer. Jerusalem. The Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem held their ground. And despite all their might, the children of Judah could not drive them out. They were forced into an uneasy coexistence. The tribe of Judah had to give up on conquering Jerusalem, leaving the city as a thorn embedded in the heart of their territory. It remained an independent mountain stronghold for nearly 400 years until King David finally managed to conquer it. Then came the turn of the house of Joseph, the descendants of Jacob's favorite son, who had saved the family in Egypt. The lot fell to the younger son, Ephraim, who received the fertile and strategic central region of the Promised Land, a territory stretching from the Jordan to the sea, rich with vegetation and mountains. Their land was enviable, full of promises of agricultural abundance and mountain strongholds. But just like their southern brothers, they too stumbled over a stone in their path. In the city of Gezer, a crucial point for trade routes, the Canaanites stood their ground, and the people of Ephraim, weary from so much warfare, didn't drive out these Canaanites as God had commanded. Instead, they made a decision. They allowed the Canaanites to remain living among them, but subjected them to forced labor and made them pay tribute. It seemed like a clever solution, exploiting the enemy's labor instead of destroying them. But this coexistence would become a slow and dangerous trap for the future. By leaving the enemy alive within their borders, they allowed poison to remain in the land, and over time, it would weaken their own identity. Thus, while the Promised Land was beginning to have owners, the first cracks were also beginning to appear. Israel dominated the map, but the enemy hadn't disappeared. They only seemed tame. Both in the south with Judah and in the center with Ephraim, the land has new owners. But by living alongside the enemy and collecting taxes from them, they planted the seeds of their future corruption. The enemy wasn't destroyed, only put to work, and over time, their influence would grow. The land was beginning to have rightful owners. But there was one tribe that received nothing. The tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi wasn't given a single acre of land to cultivate. They were reminded that their inheritance was something greater, the priesthood and direct service to God. Their land was the altar. This act of faith established that Israel's true possession wasn't the soil, but the God who had given it to them. But in the midst of this distribution of land, something striking happened. From among the crowd emerged an 85-year-old man, his back straight and eyes bright. It was Caleb, Joshua's inseparable companion. They were the only survivors from that generation that left Egypt. All the others had died in the wilderness. Of the more than 600,000 men who left Egypt, only 2 managed to cross the finish line and survive the desert: Joshua and Caleb. Caleb approached Joshua and reminded him of the promise Moses had made 45 years earlier when the two of them were the only spies who believed. And he asked for something that defied all human logic. Caleb didn't ask for a peaceful retirement in a fertile valley by a river. Instead, with a firm voice that echoed before all the leaders, he declared, "I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me. My strength then is my strength now. So give me this mountain." What was remarkable about his request was that this mountain, Hebron, wasn't some empty place. It was the most dangerous. The Anakites still lived there, the giants who had terrorized Israel in the past. and their cities were large and fortified. At 85 years old, Caleb didn't want a garden, he wanted a battlefield. He wanted to finish the job he started 45 years ago. Joshua, moved by his friend's faith, blessed him and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. Caleb marched up the mountain, not with a young man's recklessness, but with an old man's unwavering conviction. And he drove out the 3 sons of Anak, the giants who ruled the heights. He conquered the impossible and turned the place of fear into a place of peace. Hebron became a city of refuge and a symbol of what faith can do. Even at 85 years old, with the giants defeated and the land divided among the major tribes,
Yes, so that your
the
days
tabernacle,
may be
the
long
mobile
upon
tent
the
of meeting,
land.
finally found a permanent home. In Shiloh, right in the heart of the land, it was a historic moment. The presence of God was no longer wandering, it was settled. But 7 tribes still hadn't received their portions. They were hesitant, perhaps comfortable in the temporary camps. Joshua had to stir them. How long will you wait to take possession of the land the Lord has given you? He sent out surveyors to map the remaining territory. They divided the rest into 7 parts. And lots were cast in the presence of God at Shiloh. Benjamin, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan all received their inheritance. Even Joshua, the great leader, waited until everyone else was settled before choosing his own small portion in the mountains. Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. He didn't take the best for himself. He took the last portion. A leader's heart, even in victory. With the land divided, Joshua established cities of refuge, a divine system of justice. These were 6 special cities scattered throughout the land, where anyone who accidentally killed someone could flee for protection. It was a place where mercy and law met, preventing cycles of blood vengeance. Kadesh, Shechem, Hebron, Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan. These cities stood as beacons of safety. Then the Levites, who had no land of their own, were given 48 cities within the territories of the other tribes. This was a strategic placement. God wanted his ministers living among the people, to teach the law and keep the spiritual fire burning in every corner of the nation. The conquest was complete. The promise was fulfilled. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to the house of Israel failed. Everyone was fulfilled. It was a moment of absolute triumph. But a new
Do not
tension
abandon
arose.
us, my
The
Lord.
tribes of Reuben, Gad,
We are
and the
your
half-tribe of
servants.
Manasseh had finished their duty.
We beg for
They
your
had fought
protection.
alongside their brothers. And now it was time for them to return to their own lands on the eastern side of the Jordan. Joshua blessed them and sent them home with great wealth, livestock, silver, gold, and bronze. But as they crossed the river, they did something that almost triggered a civil war. They built a massive, imposing altar by the Jordan. When the rest of Israel heard about it, they were furious. They thought their brothers were starting a rival religion. The nation mobilized for war against their own kin. But before attacking, they sent a delegation led by Phinehas the priest to demand an explanation. The eastern tribes explained, "This isn't for sacrifice. It's a witness so our children will know we belong to the same God as you." Civil war was averted. Crisis turned into a moment of deeper unity. Peace finally settled over the land. Years passed in quiet abundance. Joshua was now very old, 110 years of age. He knew his journey was nearing its end. He summoned all the leaders of Israel to Shechem. It was his farewell address, a moment of profound gravity. He stood before them, a living bridge between the miracles of the past and the future. He didn't speak of his own military brilliance. He reminded them of everything God had done, from Abraham to the crossing of the Jordan. Then he issued the ultimate challenge, a choice that would echo through the ages. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. The response was a thunderous roar of commitment from the entire nation. Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and recorded it in the book of the law. He set up a large stone as a witness under the oak tree near the sanctuary. "See," he said, "this stone has heard all the words the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue." His work was finished. Joshua, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him in his own inheritance, in the hill country of Ephraim. Shortly after, the bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had carried all the way from Egypt, were finally laid to rest in Shechem, a promise kept for centuries. The generation that saw the great miracles eventually passed away. Eleazar the priest, son of Aaron, also died and was buried. The era of the giants was over. Joshua left a legacy of courage and total obedience. He showed that leadership is not about personal glory, but about being a servant of a higher purpose. Under his command, the impossible became history, the wilderness was a memory, and the promised land was a reality. But a new shadow was beginning to fall. The Bible ends this chapter with a sobering note. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and the elders who outlived him. But a new generation was rising, one that had not seen the parting of the Jordan or the falling of Jericho's walls. Their faith would soon be tested. The era of the judges was about to begin, a cycle of rebellion and rescue. But for now, the land rested. The sword of Joshua was at peace. The story of Joshua is the story of every soul. The transition from the desert of slavery to the inheritance of freedom. It requires faith to cross the river,